As soon as the Kansas Territory was open to settlement, farm families started moving in and sinking their roots here. In our first story, we take a personal look at my own family, who moved here from the hills of eastern Kentucky. Growing up on a Kansas farm in the 1950s, I learned a few things about helping with the chores. But I didn't learn much about my ancestors and what their life was like in the 1850s. I was more interested in climbing aboard one of the tractors and joining my father and brothers out in the fields. I had no clue about those who had come before us and had been the ones to first break the sod. In recent years, however, I've become a bit more curious. Who was that couple in the old photograph hanging on my father's office wall? And who was that old fellow with the long white beard sitting in the rocking chair? How was I related to him, and what was his story? Something that's been clear to me is that the Kendall family has been anchored to this land along Clarks Creek in western Morris County for several generations. My father was raised here, as was his father, and his father before that. But I haven't known much about the prior generations, where they came from and how they got here. I now know that they came from eastern Kentucky and were among the first Americans of European ancestry to settle in this area, arriving here shortly after the territory was opened to settlement. I spoke with Pete Shortridge to see if he could shed more light on this for me. Pete's a professor of cultural geography at KU and has traced the origins of the various groups who've populated the Sunflower State. He notes that there are more Southerners who settled in Kansas than many people realize.
When you look at the census of 1860 or the census of 1865, it's clear that the Missourians and the Kentuckians, which were the origin of many of the Missourians at the time, were the largest single group. They did come. A lot of attention has been given to groups of New Englanders who were upset at this assumption that there would be a slave state and who rallied support and sent settlers. The importance of the New Englanders has always been overstated, however. They were important in certain places. Lawrence, for example, was one of the colonies that was set up by these New England people. Topeka was another, Manhattan was another, and that in part right there accounts for the importance. But the actual number of New Englanders in terms of actual settlers was very small. They were important in terms of who became editors, who became governors, who wrote the history books. So there's this odd juxtaposition, I guess, an assumption of more New Englanders than there was, and a downgrading of the number of Missourians and other Southerners that were there.
The Kendall family has been in Kansas long enough that we've lost touch with our Southern roots. But it's interesting to think about how and why our ancestors made the move from eastern Kentucky to Kansas Territory. As far as I can tell, it didn't have anything to do with slavery. That wasn't what motivated them to move here, any more than what motivated other farm families to come here from places like Indiana, Illinois, or Pennsylvania.
The motivation in all these cases was really not ideology. I've been talking about ideology, and that was a motivator for some people, but the big thing was economic. They were after land. The opportunity was there. On any frontier during this time period in the United States, it was very common for you take a piece of land and 2 years later that land would have doubled in value. That itself was quite an incentive. Many people talked about if we sell our farm in Pennsylvania or Kentucky, we can take that money and we can buy 5 times the acreage.
The first of the Kendall clan to leave Kentucky headed for Kansas Territory as soon as it was open to settlement. In 1854, they packed their belongings and floated down the Ohio River to the point where it merges with the Mississippi. Then they followed an overland route across Missouri to Jackson County, where they lived for 3 years on a rented farm before moving across the border into Kansas.
The movement of your family and many other families out of Jackson County, of course, occurred as this fight over the future of Kansas heated up. And there are people who argue that the Civil War began on the Kansas-Missouri border, and there certainly was agitation. So many people decided to leave.
With border ruffians about and tensions escalating between the states, the Kendalls headed west along the Santa Fe Trail, finding land available in Willow Springs Township, south of Lawrence in Douglas County.
Willow Springs, and places like Willow Springs, is probably settled because the early settlers went up the valley. And so the high-priced land was along the valley. The projected railroad routes were along the Kansas River Valley. And so if you didn't have quite as much money, or if you're just more interested in farming than you were in speculation in town sites, this would be a place that you could have reasonable access. You could get to towns such as Lawrence that promise to be good service towns for your agricultural endeavors, and yet find your land at a cheaper price.
In 1860, the next generation of Kendalls made the move from Kentucky to Kansas, also coming to Willow Springs. A year later, shortly after Kansas became a state, my great-grandfather, William Marion Kendall, was born, the last of 9 children. Not long after that, following Quantrill's raid on Lawrence, the family decided to move a little farther west, perhaps trying to find a more tranquil setting. They ended up on Clarks Creek, near a place that was actually called Far West, Kansas. William Marion Walter was the postmaster at Far West, which may never have been more than just a crossing on the creek where he and his wife lived. They too had come here from Kentucky. In 1857, at the age of 23, Marion Walter walked to Kansas from Kentucky and got a job hauling freight along the Santa Fe Trail. He would have first arrived in Council Grove at about the same time as Seth Hayes was opening the well-known establishment that still bears his name. In 1862, he married Nancy Magdilla Burton, and 5 years later, their first and only child, Ethel Trinvilla Walter, was born. The family's primary activity was farming, and they managed to acquire a good chunk of farm ground over the years as the local farming community developed. After the first wave of settlers established themselves along Clarks Creek, some of their offspring came together to start their own families. Such was the case with our family, as Marion Walter's daughter Ethel grew up and married William Marion Kendall in the winter of 1885. They raised a family of 7 boys and 1 girl, all of whom would remain engaged in farming along this creek.
Farm families did tend to be larger than town families, and I think the work on the farm, the number of chores available, the use for the hands is probably their explanation there. The other thing, of course, that always happens in that time period is death. Death is amazingly common. I've read things recently that say if you wanted to count on 6 children reaching adulthood, you would have 10 births. So that kind of ratio.
Although none of my grandfather's siblings were claimed by death in childhood, the hazards of farming were ever present. Shortly after Christmas in 1907, his father was struck in the head when a chute broke while they were dehorning cattle. He died soon thereafter at the age of 46, having lived a life that reflected the promise of the early years of settlement in Kansas. My father was also named William Marion Kendall. The day that he died, in the summer of 2001, he was happy to pay one last visit to the grove of oak trees along Clarks Creek. It seemed as though he could feel the presence of the ancestors here and find peace of mind in connecting with the spirit of the place, a place that's now known in this area as Kendall's Grove.